Hello students, this is Dr. M. Bhushanam, Assistant Professor in Zoology, Maharani Science College for Women, Bengaluru. Hope all of you are doing well during this pandemic time. Take care of your good health. Well students, today we shall learn another topic related to paper 7, organic evolution of your syllabus, namely natural selection as an evolutionary force in the process of evolution. The objective of the study is to learn the role of natural selection within the process of evolution. The contents includes role of evolutionary force, that is natural selection, in the process of speciation. As we have understood in the earlier sessions, evolution refers to gradual change of traits of organisms due to genetic changes or variations. It takes a long period of time of millions of years. One of the driving force of this evolution is the natural selection. Natural selection is a process that allows organisms better adapted to their environment to better live and reproduce more of their children or offsprings within the changing environment. In simple, nature selects any favorable and fitted individuals by elimination of non-adaptive characters. This results in new species, which we call it as speciation. Down in the picture of the slide is an example to show natural selection in the development of long-necked giraffes, the modern day giraffes what we see, from that of short-necked giraffes. That is, in the course of long periods, the best, fittest, and suitable individuals will survive, and they become adjusted to the nature. Nature, being the superpower, selects only those adopted organisms which become different species with the accumulation of genetic changes within them, which we call it as accumulation of variations. While the ones that cannot survive are totally eliminated by the nature. This is the theory of natural selection, which is given by the father of evolution called Charles Darwin. As we know, every activity of an surviving individual is under the control of genes. And these genes are transferred from parents to the offsprings through the process of inheritance. Inheritance is transmission of characters from parents to offsprings. So genetic variations that are seen in an organism gets accumulated in the individuals, and these accumulations were transferred to the offsprings through the inheritance process. Here, every change in gene, we call it as genetic variation, gets accumulated and they are transferred from parents to the offsprings to form a new species. And this is one of the major steps that takes place in the process of natural selection. The next important requirement of natural selection in speciation is that there is overproduction of offsprings. And these offspring should show the changes within them in the genes. Or in simple, the offsprings with the genetic variations are produced more in number. First one is the genetic variations need to be seen or shown in the offsprings. In the individuals, and those characters are inherited into the offsprings, and the number of offsprings produced are more in number. More. So this is what is the importance of natural selection process. To cite an example here, the modern giraffes with long neck, a species which we see in present day, is a very suitable example for natural selection also. The ancestral giraffes, when we look at, which are seen towards the right extremity of the diagram down, they had shorter necks, and there occurred an evolutionary change, environmental change of calamity of nature that resulted in less availability of leaves on the shrubs and on the ground, but availability of this foliage or leaves were seen on the trees. So only on the long trees especially we find the evolutionary change has resulted in the foliage. So the giraffes which had genes for shorter necks now started to stretch their necks to reach the leaves on the tree, as what you see towards the extreme left side. So the genes for stretched neck were accepted by the nature, and these changed genes were inherited to their offsprings. So, with the millions of years of time, evolution of modern giraffes with a long neck were evolved from the short-necked ancestral giraffes. The reason for the evolution and natural selection of individuals with the change in genes is greater adaptation to its local environment. This is called as adaptive evolution. I repeat it again, students. Natural selection always leads to adaptation of an organism to fit to the changed environment in which it is. So this is called as adaptive evolution. Here in the example of long-necked giraffes, the giraffes are better adapted to fetch the leaves on the long trees. That is, they were successful in getting the leaves on the trees during these environmental conditions. So, they were selected by nature. Students, remember here a point. This is availability of short-necked and long-necked species of giraffes, but long-necked were selected as they were the fittest individual in the changed environment. Well, students, Darwin's natural selection has 4 key components. Let's understand each one of them. Number 1 is variations or genetic changes as the first factor that we are going to understand now. Individuals within a population exhibit changes with reference to appearance, behavior, like changes in the size, hair color, facial features, etc. These kind of changes are selected by the nature, or natural selection accepts it. At the same time, individuals with no variation, like number of eyes in our vertebrate groups. So vertebrates have only 2 eyes. No variation in these particular character, change in the gene, it remains same. So individuals with no variation are not selected by the nature. So natural selection doesn't do it. So what is first point? Variation. What does it mean? Individuals with variations which are accepted by the nature are required for natural selection process. Point number 2 is inheritance. Or inheritance can also be defined as transfer of genetic variations from the parents to offsprings. So selected traits by the nature are very strongly inherited. This is what the point that we should remember. Any characteral change that nature selects will not just remain within an individual. It starts moving from that individual to their offsprings or to their children. Generally, heterozygous individuals show better adaptation or better selected by nature than homozygous individuals. So always heterozygosity, mean to say one allele of dominant, the other allele of recessive. So this kind of heterozygous, capital T, small t, for example, such characters are selected by nature much than the homozygous variety. The third important component of natural selection is prodigality or overproduction. The selected individuals or individuals with the selected genetic variations by the nature are made to move the characters from the parents to the offsprings. And into how many offsprings is this particular characteral change is allowed. It is seen that the individuals which are selected individuals or selected individuals with the genetic variations by the nature are allowed to produce more number of offsprings than its original capacity. So nature allows their survival much than their death. That's what is the importance. First factor is variation, genetic changes it should show to suit to the changeable environment. Number 2, these characters need to be transferred to the offsprings. To how many individuals is this character transferred? It is to many. So high rate of population growth referring to the transfer of the inheritance of characters with the genetic changes are seen in many of the offsprings. Point number 4 is these offsprings that shows genetic variations in them should survive and should again reproduce. So this is called differential survival and reproduction. So what does it exactly say? In nature, homozygous individuals are less selected than heterozygous traits. That is, the individuals with well-suited traits for this struggle will be more in number, and they are capable of producing newer individuals further because they can transfer again their genes into the next generation, so that you find new species of organism getting originated. So this is about the importance of components required for the process of natural selection. During the struggle of an organism for the resources, they followed individuals should have a favoring system in them. I mean to say, they should carry the variations over the others. Nature will bring in change in frequency of traits in the population, and this is called as natural selection. I repeat it. Any organism which enters into the struggle process to become fittest individuals, they tend to show change in the frequency of traits. So, this changes if they acquire. This process is called as natural selection. Individuals with advantageous traits are produced more in number, and it is called as natural adaptation process. So overall, when we look at natural selection is leading to adaptive evolution process also, because the advantageous characters are passed on or inherited more in number into the offsprings. These adaptive changes in the characters of organisms, they generally tend to accumulate in the organisms and later they get inherited. So, natural selection works on existing variations within given selected population. Then how are these genetic variations are formed? Again and again we are saying that there is change in environment, and the organisms also show changes in their traits to adapt to that environment. How are these changes are formed in these organisms? In simple, the question is how genetic variations are induced in the organisms. Scientists have found that mutations and chromosomal changes in the selected traits are selected by the nature itself. So as we know, any mutation could be advantageous or disadvantageous for an organism. But natural selection will select only the organisms with advantageous mutations. So it should be helpful for the animal, helpful for the nature. Few classical examples to cite are, number one, industrial melanism in peppered moth. So this is a very classical example related to natural selection, students. Try to understand it. Prior to 1800s, in England, there existed peppered moth called Biston betularia were of very light colored, and at the same time industries were also less in number during those days. These peppered moth used to feed on lichens on tree trunks. So the other species of Biston, that is peppered moth, were dark colored or melanic species of moth, and those particular moths were very lesser in number. We can see the two species of moth, one with light color, the other one with the dark color, down in the slide here. Actually here when we look at light color peppered moth mimics the background on which it is, or otherwise I can say the color of the light peppered moth started to blend with the color of its background, that's on the tree trunk. Whereas the left side we find dark peppered moth, that is melanic form. It is easy to sight, easy to make out. So such a species of darker melanic forms of moth were totally fed by the predators like birds. So before industrialization, we find light colored moths, peppered moths were many in number in England. Dark ones were lesser in number. So this was in a period of time, that is in 1800s. But later to 1800s, that is during 1880s, industrial revolution took place in England, and the result was pollution. Example is soot, the black smoke, and other industrial waste started accumulate on the tree trunks, and these pollutants also had effect on the lichens that were present. So lichens were also killed, and the food for these insect moths was also lost on one side. On the other side, the light colored peppered moth, which were seen more in number, started to reduce in its number after the industrialization. Reason was that as the dark colored soot started accumulating on the tree trunk, the dark species of moth started blending with the environment, whereas light ones started to show a difference in the color. Mean to say, the background started dark, so dark ones were blending with the background and light ones were easily selected by the predators. So predators started eating the light ones. So there came a time in the evolution process where in 1886 they could find more of the dark or melanic moths than the light ones. So what happened to this environmental change here? Here, the change in the environment of because of industrialization had selected the dark colored moths than the light colored one. Okay, and these characters of light colored moths were totally eliminated from the nature, and the dark colored ones were selected by the nature. The birds which acts as the predators were also one of the factors to control the population of light colored moth than the dark colored ones. So this is called as local adaptation and natural selection. That is, change in environment will bring in certain genetic changes and will allow the organisms to better adapt to these environmental changes. Hence, the natural selection will be seen in the individuals that shows the better adaptive changes. The best example here is dark peppered moth than the light ones were selected with the local adaptations. The next concept is all widespread experiences in different environmental conditions that is, if a population is very large, they will experience different environmental conditions at different geographical areas where they are. Hence, different subspecies can be formed within the original population. So this is again related to formation of a newer species. To cite an example for it is rat snake Elaphea absolata. This variety of rat snakes are seen in eastern North America. So different subspecies of these rat snakes of eastern North America are called geographic races or biological races because they share a common gene pool. When you look at the diagram down here, color variation you find in the snakes of different geographical area, but they all belongs to the same group of rat snakes, but variation in their appearance wise, I mean to say color wise, features wise, at different parts of this Eastern North America is seen. Why is this difference in the color, difference in the feature? It is due to the subspecies formation. So species will again can show changes in their characters based on the environmental change. This we call it as formation of races or subspecies. We also call it as biological races. Remember students, biological races do not show reproductive mating. So they are reproductively isolated individuals. So their subspecies are also different. So another classical example of natural selection is the Galapagos finches of Darwin. So Darwin's natural selection includes a classical example of Galapagos finches, where 14 species of finches are due to variety of food available to them. So the beaks got modified in all these 14 finches. Eating food like large seeds, small seeds, feeding on birds, then fruits, small insects, etc., had led to the variety of beaks in the finches also. So according to Darwin, the ancestral finches would have their habitat, that is their living place, on a main island of South America and some 600 miles to east. But different feeding habits within them are different geographical distribution areas had led to the diversity of finches also. That's on Galapagos Islands. So that you can see in the picture down. So right towards the left side, you have one finch variety, which is a common ancestor. So based on the feeding habits, you can find the variation in the beak of different finch varieties of those 14 numbers or 50 numbers that Darwin could cite. So that's about the importance of examples related to natural selection. Students, now under natural selection, we have learnt about the definition of natural selection, then components of natural selection, how it happens, then the process of natural selection, and examples related to natural selection. The next important concept is types of natural selection or types of selection. There are three different types of selection that occurs in nature, in the changing environments generally. Namely, number one, directional selection, number two, disruptive selection, number three, stabilizing selection. It's simple to understand these three types. In directional selection, the first type, only one phenotype is favored. If I could take a Mendelian traits of characters of organisms, I find towards one end the dominant characters, for example, tall character. The other extremity, I find the recessive character, that is dwarf character. So a plant of tall, a plant of dwarf are seen towards two extremities. And in the middle, there could be the possibility of medium height plants also in between the tall and dwarf plant. So we have three varieties. In one population, we have tall, the other population we have dwarf, in the middle we have medium sized plants also. If this is the condition, understand, in directional selection, the first type, only one phenotype is favored. Which is that phenotype? It could be either dominant or could be recessive. So out of these two extremities, two ends, one of the end is selected by the nature. The rest two, that is middle one and another extremity and our characters of the other end are totally eliminated by the nature. This is the first one. So when you plot a graph, the allele frequency starts shifting towards one direction only. So highest peak is seen towards either of this end or of the other end. Okay, this is directional selection. The second type is disruptive selection. Here, the natural selection will select only two extremities, but not the middle one. So same time, both the extremities, both the ends will be selected. So tall character is also selected, dwarf character is also selected at the same time. So nature will start eliminating the middle character. So if only one is selected, it is directional selection. If both the extremities are selected, it is disruptive selection. The third type is stabilizing selection. I think by now you would have guessed it. Here, the natural selection will select the middle trait, excluding or eliminating both the extremities. So middle trait is selected. So here, in stabilizing selection, when you plot a graph, you find a peak only for the middle one. What happens to the two extremities? It goes down. So in directional selection, the graph when you plot, it will be, the peak will appear only towards one end, either of right side or of left side. In disruptive selection, two peaks will appear at two extremities, middle one goes down. Whereas in case of stabilizing selection, the peak will appear only at the middle, not at the extremities. So in a standard distribution of a trait, a normal bell curve, as what is shown in the picture here, of distribution is seen. It is due to no selection pressure on the trait. So nature will not select any of the trait here if that is the condition. Tall and dwarf or short individuals will form two extremities with a less number, and average or height individuals are generally selected, and they will be many in number in the nature. So heterozygous individuals, that's how you can remember. Homozygous tall, homozygous recessive, heterozygous individual. Heterozygous individuals will be selected much by the nature. In case of directional selection, selective pressures of natural selection, as we have understood just now, it will work on one of the extremity of trait only. That is, either of tall or of short only, will be selected. So only one will be selected here. So the selected individuals are more in common. That is, either tall individuals will be common, or selected individuals, if they are dwarf, only dwarf individuals will be in common. Then what will happen to the other unselected extremity and the middle trait? It will be totally not selected, so it gets eliminated in the nature, or their number will fall down. So when we plot a graph of directional selection, it leans more towards one side. Example 1 is longest neck of giraffes, which were selected more than the short-necked ones. So only long-necked giraffes become more common than the short-necked in the environment. So only one extremity is selected by the nature. An example for the directional selection. The second example is very interesting example. That is, thicker shelled oysters were selected more due to more resistant to the breakage than the thinner shelled oysters. Crabs will feed on the content of oysters within. They collect the oysters, they throw the oysters on the rocks so that the oysters will break. After breaking, the inner content will be fed by the crabs. They are carnivores generally. But here is a condition: if the shell of the oyster is thicker, even after breakage, if it doesn't break, such ones will not be selected by the nature. So it will be, such will be selected by the nature, so it will be left by the crabs. So number of thick-walled or thick-shelled oysters becomes more in number. It gets increased when we compare to thin-walled oysters. So thin-walled oysters, when are broken against the rocks by the crabs, it will break so easily they can feed on the content. So when we look at the thicker shelled and the thinner shelled oysters, thicker shelled oysters are selected by the nature, so their number increases more than the thin-walled. The third example is related to the lineage of modern hares, equus. That is evolution of modern hares. You know, this modern hares is descended from a tiny dawn hare called Hyracotherium. Down in the picture you can see it is to the size of a dog. So fast swifting, fast moving horses with long legs had got selected for very fast speed on the open and grasslands. Similarly, changes in their teeth, changes in their toe structures had got selected by the nature. So a new species got formed from the older one, which was selected by the nature itself. Fittest individuals are selected by the nature. So this is again an example related to directional selection. So when you draw a graph, the original graph is denoted with the discontinuous lines here. Whereas The blue shaded a peak or graph is representing selection of only one extremity by the nature. So original one is that discontinuous lane of graph. It got shifted towards one side. So this is called as directional selection. The second type we have is disruptive selection. In this type of natural selection favors only two extremities, but the middle one is eliminated. When two extremities are selected, both the extremities or characters will be seen more in number in the nature. So this is not a common process that we find in nature generally. It is for the theoretical interest. So two characters at a time of two extremities will not be selected. So it is a theoretical concept. When we draw a graph of it, you find both the extremities showing two peaks at both ends. So this is a kind of model of graph which we call it as bimodal. So intermediate trait is very less in common, or it will be lost in the environment. Thus we call it as disruptive selection. It always leads to formation of two new species at a time. Okay, two species can be formed at a time, but this is not commonly seen in the nature. So to cite an example, rabbits of black, white and grey color which are seen on rocky forests, a rocky environment. White and black are selected by nature, which are of two extremities, as they show blending of their body color with that of the rocks on which they are. So predators like birds will easily select the intermediate color ones, that is the grey one. So this is an example to cite there. The second example is light and dark colored oysters on rocks of shallow waters. Intermediate color oysters here are more preyed by the crabs. So crabs can easily make out the presence of intermediate color oysters. So they can easily catch them, break against the rocks, and the content can be fed later. Hence both light and dark colored oysters are selected by the nature, and they remain very common, and their number will increase in the nature. Here in the diagram we can find an example showing the disruptive selection process. So two extremities are selected, not the middle one. Here the picture of the slide shows disruptive selection where nature selects two extremities of dark and light colored individuals. So when a graph is drawn for the disruptive selection, it shows a bimodal peaks. This here at two ends we find the peak structures for the curve. So middle one is not selected. So bimodal graph we call it as for disruptive selection. The third type of selection is stabilizing selection. In this type of natural selection occurs only for the middle trait, so two extremities of the characters were not selected, so they become eliminated in the nature, whereas the middle characters or intermediate characters are selected by the nature. So here is a picture to show the stabilizing selection down. So we find at two extremities, if it is a dark colored and light colored organisms, either one of it, when it is selected, we call it as directional selection, first picture. In the middle picture, two extremities are selected together, which we call it as disruptive selection. So in first, only either one will be selected. In second, both our extremities are selected, not the intermediate. So into marks will represent, cross mark represent unselection. Whereas down, the third stabilizing selection, when we look at, the two extremities are not selected, only the intermediate one are selected. Example is related here for stabilizing selection is related to plants. Plants with three varieties of forest area. One is extremely tall, the other is extremely dwarf, the middle one is of average height or intermediate height. Tall plants are exposed to more of the winds, so there is risk of survival is more because of the wind. Short plants die due to lesser availability of sunlight, but plants with intermediate height or middle height gets both sunlight and protected from the wind too. So the intermediate ones are selected by the nature. So down in the picture you can find a canopy having tall plants, intermediate plants, and trees and short trees. Intermediates are selected much by the nature. Second example is related to the mice population that lives in the woods or forest. Here, the dark ones and light ones are not selected. Intermediate ones, which are blended much with the environment on which they are selected. So this is again related to the stabilizing selection. So you can find here the example to cite. Mice will carry alleles that make them slightly lighter or slightly darker. It will help them to match with the ground on which they are. If the ground color and the color of the body, if it matches, when the color gets blended with the background, the predators will predate only the organisms that are of different color on the background. For example, in the first picture, white one is clearly seen. In the second picture, dark one is clearly seen. So those individuals are easily plucked by the predators. So genetic variance are generally will start decreasing in case of the stabilizing selection. Third example is oysters again. Here, in stabilizing selection, two extremities are not selected, intermediate are selected. Reason is that the background to which the intermediate oysters, if at all, gets matched up, then the predators will have, the shorebirds will have the confusion, and they start feeding only on the extreme characters. So the middle ones are not affected. So it is called stabilizing selection. So when the graph is plotted in stabilizing selection, it will show a peak only in the middle zone. The two extremities do not show any values. That's about three types of natural selection, students. So after we understanding those three types, it is also there is also an interesting selection type seen, which we call it as kin selection. In case of natural selection, sometimes we find this type of kin selection that involves altruistic behavior. What is this? It is an example where offsprings are protected by the parents or sometimes their close relatives in order to restore the genes, a gene pool. So remember, this selection occurs at the expense of the individual itself. The best examples are honeybees for kin selection. Natural selection will favor a trait that benefit the related individuals of the colony. It's a very complex behavior. Here, the worker bees exhibit kin selection or altruistic behavior. While stinging the enemies, it damages itself. So exactly when a worker bee stings the enemy, it will leave its sting in the body of the enemy. So the digestive part, that is the sting, gets disrupted. It cannot feed further. It will die. It is one side. The other side, it will make the enemies, it will stop the enemies to reach the hive. So two incidents are happening here. Number one, the worker bee sacrifices itself by stinging the enemy and makes that enemy not to reach the hive. Why the enemy should not reach the hive? It is because there are the individuals which are reproductively active, potent individuals like queen and kings, drones. So they need to be preserved, they need to be protected. For that sake, the worker bees will sacrifice themselves. That's one part. So worker bees also do not reproduce individuals of the colony. So they are reproductively inactive individuals. But reproductive active individuals are queen and drones. So at the cost of the life of the worker bee, they protect the close relatives like the queen and drone and other workers of the colony. So main motto is to protect the queen and drones of the hive, so that those reproductively active individuals which are left in the hive can reproduce more of the individuals or offsprings of the colony and benefit the hive. So this is called as altruistic behavior or kin selection. So similarly, there is another type of selection called sexual selection. It's a type of natural selection where the organisms with survival abilities and reproducing abilities are selected by the nature. So if any organism that has good survivability and good reproductive potency, such individuals will be selected by the nature. This we call it as sexual selection. To reproduce an individual, there is a need of mating partner. And the offspring that is produced should be very viable, very strong, very potent. So natural selection favors traits where maximum competition will be seen in the individuals to attract the mate and reproduce more potent and strong offsprings, which we call it as sexual selection. Down is the picture to depict the concept of sexual selection, students. So individuals should have more ability to attract the mates and reproduce. And second one is the offsprings what they produce should be very potent. So in sexual selection, a force that determines mating choice and that acts on a selected genotype that favors selected adaptation process. So selected force will of the individual is by mating choice and genotypes that are seen that undergoes changes in them, so that totally a new species will be formed later. In the picture down you can find towards left side, the first starting point is before selection process we find yellow, orange and red colored individuals. After selection only red ones are seen. So that is selected individuals. They will have to produce more by reproducing potent individuals need to be formed. So final population is only red. So what happened to the total change in the selection process? By the genotypic variations in them that get accumulated. So choice is given by the nature for the potent individuals and highly reproducing individuals. At the same time, the offspring form should be very, very capable, very potent. Such individuals are selected by the nature. The next component under sexual dimorphism, sexual selection is sexual dimorphism. So diamonds to morphomens external appearance. So individuals where a male and female will show clear demarcations with the appearance of characters is called sexual dimorphism. In sexual selection, sexual dimorphism is an important factor where the offsprings produced are accommodated and adapted. I repeat it. If an organism of male or a female that need to enter into mating process, if during the mating process it should be vigorous and potent, mating should be very strong. The second factor is it should be capable of producing good offsprings and it should protect the offsprings also. So only such individuals are selected by the nature. Example is, there is presence of brood pouch in the male seahorses. So brood pouch in seahorse, male seahorse, is a better adopted character for making the individuals protective. The parent individual will protect the offsprings by giving parental care. Such individuals are selected by the nature much. The second example is comb shell called Epheblasma brevidens of Midwest America, where shell is oval to quadrate in shape. So shape of the shell is important here. Females show a low bulge of shell to accommodate enlarged gills, in which a brood pouch which acts as brood pouch for the larvae. So this bulging of shell in male is lacking. Why females have larger bulge shell? It is to favor better reproduction of offsprings, better development of offsprings. But in case of males, the shell is less bulging, so gills do not involve in the breeding process here. Brood pouch activity is not seen. So the character change will be different sexually. So sexually dimorphic individuals also should possess certain of characters that should favor the environment, especially in bringing up of the offsprings, potent offsprings. So with this we are completing the concept of natural selection, students. So let us now understand MCQs. Question 1. A mutation is any change in the dash of gene of chromosome. So it is DNA of gene. Answer is A. What kind of mutation is caused by